At 5:47 in the morning, Margot sat alone in her kitchen, waiting. Her husband stumbled through the door, reeking of another woman's perfume, expecting his obedient wife to stay silent. But this time, she was not silent. She was ready. In her pocket was a list. 7 lines written by their 8-year-old son. 7 things he would never forgive his father for. And in her hand was the evidence that would destroy everything Preston had built. What happens when a mother stops being afraid? When she chooses war over silence? Stay until the end. This story will change how you see strength. If it moves you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The kitchen clock read 5:47 in the morning when Margot Sinclair heard the front door click open. She sat perfectly still at the marble island, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee she had stopped drinking 3 hours ago. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant rhythm of her own heartbeat pounding against her ribs. She had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it. And yet, when she heard Preston's footsteps crossing the foyer, something inside her chest tightened like a fist. The lights were off except for the single pendant lamp above the counter, casting a golden circle onto the white marble. Margot had positioned herself deliberately within that light, knowing exactly what her husband would see when he stumbled through the kitchen door. Preston appeared in the doorway, his tie hanging loose around his neck. His shirt wrinkled in ways that suggested it had been removed and hastily replaced. The faint scent reached her before he even stepped fully into the room. Sweet, floral, unmistakably feminine. A perfume that did not belong on a married man's collar. He froze when he saw her sitting there. For 3 heartbeats, neither of them spoke. Margot studied his face, watching the emotions flicker across his features. Surprise, irritation, and then settling into place like a familiar mask. Arrogance. Preston ran a hand through his disheveled hair and walked to the refrigerator without looking at her. He pulled out a bottle of water and twisted off the cap with practiced casualness. Margot said quietly, "Long night at the office." He took a long drink before responding. "Client dinner ran late. You know how these things go." She did know. She had known for 18 months exactly how these things went. The late nights, the weekend conferences that did not exist on any company calendar. The receipts she had found tucked into jacket pockets, bearing the names of hotels and restaurants she had never visited with him. But tonight was different. Tonight, Margot was done pretending. She slid a manila folder across the marble counter toward him. Preston glanced at it with a frown. He asked, "What is this?" Margot replied. "Open it." He set down the water bottle and flipped open the folder with the impatience of a man interrupted from more important matters. She watched his face as he processed the contents. Bank statements, hotel receipts, photographs. The arrogance drained from his expression like water from a cracked vessel. Preston's voice dropped dangerously low. "Where did you get these?" she answered simply. "It does not matter where I got them. What matters is that I have them, and so does my lawyer." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Preston's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had known him, Margot saw something flicker behind his eyes that looked almost like fear. But only for a moment. Then the mask returned. "Harder than before," he said through clenched teeth. "You went through my private accounts. You hired someone to follow me. Do you have any idea what you have done?" Margot stood slowly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I know exactly what I have done. I protected myself. I protected Oliver. Something you stopped doing a long time ago." At the mention of their son's name, something shifted in the kitchen. The tension crystallized into something sharper, more dangerous. Preston stepped toward her, and Margot instinctively stepped back. He noticed. A cold smile curved his lips. He said, "Oh, you are not going anywhere. You signed a prenup. You remember that, do you not? You walk out that door. You get nothing, no money, no house, and my mother's lawyers will make absolutely certain you never see Oliver again." The threat landed exactly where he intended it to land. Margot felt the words pierce through her carefully constructed armor, striking at the only thing that truly mattered to her. But before she could respond, a small voice came from the hallway. "Mom." They both turned. Oliver stood in the kitchen doorway in his dinosaur pajamas, clutching a folded piece of paper in his small hands. His dark hair was mussed from sleep, and his eyes moved between his parents with an understanding that no 8-year-old should possess. Preston's voice shifted instantly, becoming warm and paternal. Hey, buddy, what are you doing up so early? Oliver did not look at his father. Instead, he walked directly to Margot and held out the paper. He said quietly, I wrote this for Dad. I want him to read it. Margot's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the letters slightly uneven in the way of a child who had taken great pains to get each word right. She read the title aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Things I will never forgive Dad for. Preston's face went pale. Margot continued reading, each line striking her heart like a hammer blow. Number 1, you missed my championship game to work, but I saw you at a restaurant with her. She looked up at Preston, her eyes burning. Number 2, you made Mom cry on her birthday, Preston said sharply. Oliver, go back to bed. But Oliver stood his ground. His small chin lifted, and in that moment, Margot saw something she had never seen in her son before. Defiance? Oliver said, No, I want you to hear it. All of it. Margot continued reading. Number 3, you told me I was a mistake that trapped you. Her voice cracked on the word mistake. Number 4, you promised Disney World. You took her to Paris instead. Number 5, you told Mom she was lucky you did not leave. Number 6, you forgot Aiden. Should I exist? The kitchen fell absolutely silent. Preston stared at his son as if seeing him for the first time. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Oliver turned and walked back toward his bedroom without another word. His small footsteps echoed through the hallway, each one punctuating the devastation he had left behind. Margot carefully refolded the paper and placed it in her pocket. When she looked at Preston again, something had changed in her eyes. The fear was still there, buried deep, but rising above it was something stronger. She said, I am leaving, and I am taking Oliver with me. Preston's voice came out strangled. You cannot. Margot picked up her phone from the counter. Watch me. As she walked past him toward the hallway, she felt his hand close around her wrist. Hard, bruising. He hissed. This is not over. Margot met his eyes without flinching. No, it is just beginning. She pulled free and walked away, leaving Preston standing alone in the harsh light of the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of everything he had destroyed. 3 months earlier, Margot had made a decision that would change everything. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in the parking lot of Oliver's elementary school. While she waited in her silver SUV for dismissal, she had been scrolling through Preston's iPad, which he had accidentally left on the kitchen counter that morning. She told herself she was just checking his calendar to coordinate their schedules. But somewhere between the meeting requests and conference calls, she found the text messages. Vivian. The name appeared over and over, attached to messages that left nothing to the imagination. Weekend getaways, hotel reservations, promises whispered in the language of betrayal. Margot sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the screen until her vision blurred with tears. When Oliver climbed into the back seat, chattering about his spelling test, she smiled and asked all the right questions. But inside, something had fundamentally shifted. That night, she made a phone call. Caroline Foster answered on the third ring. They had been roommates at Yale Law School, back when Margot still believed she would build a career of her own. Back before she met Preston and slowly surrendered her ambitions to become the perfect wife, the flawless hostess, the invisible woman behind a powerful man. Caroline now ran a crisis management firm in Manhattan, handling scandals for politicians and executives who needed their secrets buried. She was brilliant, ruthless, and the only person Margot trusted completely. Margot said into the phone, I need your help, Caroline asked. What did he do? Even over the phone, Margot could hear the protective edge in her friend's voice. Caroline had never liked Preston. She had warned Margot years ago that men like him viewed wives as accessories, interchangeable and disposable. Margot told her everything. When she finished, Caroline was silent for a long moment. Then she said, You need Diana Hartwell. She is the best divorce attorney in Connecticut. And you need Marcus Webb, private investigator, extremely discreet, Margot whispered. The prenup. He made me sign a prenup before the wedding. If I leave without proof of fault, I get nothing, Caroline replied. Then we get proof. But Margot, you have to be careful. Preston is not stupid, and his mother's money gives him resources most husbands do not have. If he figures out what you are planning before you are ready to move, he will destroy you. For the next 3 months, Margot became someone she barely recognized. On the surface, she remained the dutiful wife, attending charity galas on Preston's arm, hosting dinner parties for his colleagues, smiling through events where Vivian Cross stood across the room pretending they had never met. But beneath the surface, she was building her case. Diana Hartwell was exactly what Caroline had promised. Silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with a reputation for dismantling cheating husbands with surgical precision. Her office in downtown Hartford was decorated with photographs of herself with various governors and senators, testimonials to her power and influence. Diana reviewed the prenup in their first meeting. Her eyebrows rose slightly as she read. She said, "There is an infidelity clause. If you can prove adultery with documented evidence, you receive 60% of marital assets and primary custody preference." Margot asked. "And if I cannot prove it," Diana replied, "then you walk away with your personal belongings and whatever goodwill Preston chooses to extend, which, based on what you have told me about him, would be exactly nothing." The investigation took 3 months. Marcus Webb was a former FBI agent with silver temples and a quiet demeanor that made him almost invisible in any crowd. He photographed Preston and Vivian at 4 different hotels across Connecticut and New York. He documented the expensive gifts, the weekend trips disguised as business conferences, the apartment Preston had secretly rented for his mistress in Manhattan. But Marcus found something else, too, something far more dangerous. During their third meeting, in a coffee shop far from Greenwich, Marcus slid a second folder across the table. He said, "Mrs. Sinclair, there is something you need to see. Your husband's hedge fund is not what he claims it is." Margot frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus explained. "The returns he reports to investors do not match the actual performance. He is using money from new clients to pay returns to existing ones. Classic Ponzi structure. And that woman, Vivian Cross, she is not just his mistress. She is his recruiter. She attends charity events, befriends wealthy women, and brings them into the fund." Margot felt the blood drain from her face. "Are you saying my husband is running a fraud?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I am saying that if the SEC opens an investigation, your husband will not just lose his marriage. He will go to prison." The weight of this information settled over Margot like a physical force. She had expected betrayal. She had prepared for infidelity. But this went beyond anything she had imagined. Diana Hartwell, when informed, went completely still for almost a full minute. Then she looked at Margot with new intensity. Diana said, "This changes everything." Changes. The affair documentation alone would have given you a strong case. But financial fraud of this magnitude, you are not just divorcing him. Margot, you are potentially the key witness in a federal investigation. Margot's voice trembled. "I just want to protect Oliver. I just want to get out," Diana replied. "Then we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. If Preston discovers what you know before we are ready to move, he will become dangerous. Men like him, when cornered, become unpredictable." Caroline arranged a safe house, her Brooklyn brownstone, purchased years ago as an investment property, stood empty and waiting. Margot began secretly moving small items, things that mattered: Oliver's baby photos, her grandmother's jewelry, documents she might need. She told Oliver nothing. He was too young to carry that kind of secret, too young to understand the danger they were in. But she noticed him watching her with those observant eyes, sensing that something had shifted in their home. The night before she planned to leave, Margot stood in Oliver's doorway and watched him sleep. His small chest rose and fell with the easy rhythm of childhood dreams. The stuffed bear Preston had given him on his 5th birthday lay tucked against his side. Margot whispered into the darkness, "I will protect you, whatever it takes." She did not know that Preston's IT department had already flagged her internet searches. She did not know that Eleanor Caldwell's lawyers were already preparing countermeasures. She did not know that the war she was about to start would nearly destroy her before she found the strength to win. But standing in that doorway, watching her son sleep, Margot made herself a promise. She would not break. The morning after Margot's confrontation with Preston, she woke to the sound of pounding on Caroline's apartment door. She had barely slept, her mind racing through escape routes and contingency plans. While Oliver dozed fitfully on the pull-out couch in the living room, Caroline appeared in the hallway, cinching her robe, her expression already hardened for battle. She said quietly, "Stay back. Let me handle this." But when Caroline opened the door, it was not Preston standing in the hallway. It was a uniformed police officer accompanied by a woman in a gray suit carrying a clipboard. The woman said, "I am Sandra Mitchell from Child Protective Services. We received a report regarding the welfare of Oliver Caldwell. I need to speak with Margot Sinclair." Margot's blood turned to ice. She stepped forward, forcing her voice to remain calm. "I am Margot. What is this about?" The CPS worker consulted her clipboard. "We received a report from your husband indicating concerns about your mental stability and potential neglect of your son. We are required to conduct an investigation." Caroline interjected immediately, her lawyer instincts taking over. "This is clearly a retaliatory filing. My client left an abusive situation less than 12 hours ago, and now her husband is weaponizing child services against her." Sandra Mitchell's expression remained neutral. "I understand this is a difficult situation. However, we are legally obligated to follow up on all reports. I need to see the child and ask him some questions." Margot felt the room spinning around her. This was Preston's countermove. He had struck before she even had time to breathe, using the very institutions meant to protect children as a weapon against her. Oliver appeared in the hallway, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, what is happening?" Margot knelt down to his level, smoothing his hair with trembling fingers. "It is okay, sweetheart. This nice lady just needs to ask you a few questions. Nothing scary. Just tell the truth." "Okay." Sandra Mitchell led Oliver to the small kitchen table while Margot and Caroline waited in the living room. Every minute felt like an hour. Margot strained to hear the conversation, catching only fragments. "Does your mommy ever hurt you? Does your mommy take good care of you? Are you scared of your mommy?" Oliver's voice was soft, hesitant. He was 8 years old, overwhelmed by the sudden upheaval of his world, and now a stranger was asking him questions about his mother with a tone that implied something was wrong. When the interview ended, Sandra Mitchell returned to the living room with a carefully neutral expression. She said, "Oliver seems well cared for. However, given the circumstances, we will need to complete our investigation before we can close the case. Mr. Caldwell has provided testimony from household staff regarding concerning behaviors." Margot's voice cracked. "What testimony, what behaviors?" Sandra replied. "I am not at liberty to share those details at this time. Someone will be in contact within 72 hours. After the CPS worker left, Margot collapsed onto the couch. Caroline immediately pulled out her phone and began making calls. Margot whispered, "He is going to take Oliver away from me," Caroline said firmly. "Not if I have anything to say about it. I am calling Diana right now." But the next 72 hours brought nothing but escalating horror. First came the call from Diana Hartwell. Preston's lawyers had filed a motion claiming Margot had absconded with Oliver and was in violation of unspecified custody arrangements. They were requesting emergency custody be granted to Eleanor Caldwell. Then came the notification that Margot's bank accounts had been frozen. Preston claimed she had stolen marital funds. Every credit card she possessed was suddenly declined. Finally, Diana called with news that made Margot sink to the floor. Diana said, "I have been hit with a bar complaint. Caldwell family attorneys are claiming I engaged in unethical behavior by advising you to hide marital assets. It is completely fabricated, but I am required to temporarily step back from your case until the review is complete." 3 catastrophes, one after another, like a carefully orchestrated avalanche designed to bury her. Margot sat on the bathroom floor that night, her knees pulled to her chest, gasping for air that would not seem to fill her lungs. The walls pressed in around her. The future stretched ahead like a dark void. Oliver knocked softly on the door. "Mom, are you okay?" She covered her mouth, willing herself not to cry where he could hear. She had to be strong. She had to hold herself together for him. But the panic clawed at her throat, and for one terrifying moment, she wondered if Preston was right. Maybe she was unstable. Maybe she was incapable of providing for her son. Maybe she had made a terrible mistake. The door creaked open, and Oliver slipped inside. Without a word, he sat down beside her on the cold tile floor and took her hand in his small fingers. He said quietly, "I am not scared, Mom, because you are brave. You are the bravest person I know." The words broke something inside her. Margot pulled her son close and wept, great shaking sobs that seemed to empty her of everything she had been holding back. Oliver did not pull away. He simply held on, his small arms wrapped around her like an anchor. When the storm finally passed, Margot looked at her son with new clarity. She said, "Abin, you are right. I am brave, and I am going to fix this. I promise." Oliver nodded solemnly. "I believe you." That night, after Oliver fell asleep, Margot made a decision. Preston wanted to destroy her. He wanted to isolate her, impoverish her, and take her son. He believed she was weak, that she would crumble under the pressure. He was wrong. She opened her laptop and began to compose an email to Carolyn. If they wanted to fight dirty, Margot would learn to fight dirtier. The emergency custody hearing took place exactly 1 week after Margot fled Greenwich. She sat in the family courtroom in a borrowed blazer, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching as Preston's legal team methodically dismantled everything she had built. Preston himself sat across the aisle, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his expression a perfect mask of wounded concern. Eleanor Caldwell occupied the row behind him, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her cold eyes fixed on Margot with undisguised contempt. The Caldwell family attorney, a man named Randall Whitmore, whose reputation for destroying opposing parties preceded him, presented his case with theatrical precision. He said to the court, "Your Honor, we have testimony from 3 household employees who observed Mrs. Sinclair engaging in erratic behavior, drinking excessively, screaming at her son, and on one occasion, physical aggression." The words hit Margot like physical blows. None of it was true. She barely drank at all. She had never, not once, raised a hand to Oliver. Carolyn, serving as her temporary legal representative until Diana could return, stood immediately. "Your Honor, these are fabricated accusations designed to punish my client for leaving an abusive marriage. These so-called witnesses are employees whose immigration status depends on the Caldwell family's sponsorship." Judge Patricia Winters, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, raised a hand. "That is a serious allegation. Counselor, do you have evidence to support it?" Carolyn hesitated. "We are in the process of gathering documentation." Randall Whitmore smiled thinly. "In the meantime, the court has an obligation to protect this child. We are requesting temporary placement with Eleanor Caldwell while the investigation continues." Margot's heart stopped. She leaned toward Caroline and whispered desperately, "You cannot let them give Oliver to that woman. She hates me. She will poison him against me." Caroline squeezed her hand but said nothing. Her expression told Margot everything she needed to know. Judge Winters reviewed the documents before her for an agonizing minute. Then she looked up, her gaze settling on Margot with an unreadable expression. The judge said, "Given the serious nature of the allegations and the ongoing CPS investigation, I am granting temporary custody to Eleanor Caldwell. Mrs. Sinclair will be permitted supervised visitation twice weekly until the investigation concludes." The gavel came down like a death sentence. Margot heard herself screaming, felt Caroline's hands gripping her arms, but everything seemed distant, muffled, as if she were drowning in deep water. The bailiff approached. Preston's lawyer murmured something about orderly transfer. And then Oliver was there, standing in the aisle tall, his small face crumpling with fear. He cried, "Mom, Mom, do not let them take me." Margot lunged toward him, but the bailiff held her back. Eleanor Caldwell appeared beside Oliver, placing a manicured hand on his shoulder with the proprietary air of someone claiming an object. Eleanor said smoothly, "Come along, Oliver. Grandmother is going to take care of you now." Oliver looked back at Margot, his eyes bright with tears. "Mom, please." Margot's voice broke as she called out, "I love you, Oliver. I am going to fix this. I promise. I promise." But Oliver was already being led away, through a side door, out of her reach. The last thing she saw was his small hand reaching back toward her before the door closed between them. Margot collapsed in the hallway outside the courtroom. Carolyn knelt beside her, speaking words of comfort that could not penetrate the devastation. Preston walked past without looking at her, but Eleanor paused, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She said quietly, so only Margot could hear, You should have known better than to challenge this family. Women like you never win. You simply lack the breeding. Then she was gone, following the path they had taken her grandson, leaving Margot broken on the cold courthouse floor. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of grief. Margot could not eat. She could barely sleep. She spent hours staring at photographs of Oliver on her phone, replaying his voice in her memory, counting the minutes until her next supervised visitation. The first visit took place in a sterile observation room with a CPS worker present. Oliver ran to her the moment she entered, throwing his arms around her waist with desperate strength. He whispered, "I hate it there, Mom. Grandmother says you are sick. She says you cannot take care of me anymore." Margot held him close, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. "That is not true, sweetheart. I am not sick, and I am going to bring you home. I just need you to be brave a little while longer." Oliver pulled back and looked at her with those solemn eyes. "I am trying, Mom, but it is really hard." When the visit ended and Oliver was led away again, Margot felt a piece of her soul tear loose and follow him. That night, she sat alone in Caroline's apartment, staring at the wall with hollow eyes. Caroline approached carefully. "Margot, we need to talk about next steps." Margot's voice was flat. "There are no next steps. They took my son. They took everything." Caroline sat down beside her. "Marcus called. He has been digging deeper into Preston's finances. There is more evidence of fraud, enough to bring federal attention. If we can expose what Preston has done, everything changes." Margot shook her head slowly. "I am too tired to fight anymore." Caroline grabbed her shoulders and forced Margot to meet her eyes. "Listen to me. Your son is counting on you. Oliver is in that house with people who want to turn him against you. Every day that passes is another day they are whispering poison in his ears. You do not have the luxury of giving up." Something flickered in Margot's dead eyes. A spark, small but persistent. She whispered, "What do we need to do?" Caroline smiled grimly. "We burn it all down." 2 weeks after losing custody of Oliver, Margot walked into a coffee shop in Lower Manhattan to meet the man who might help her destroy her husband. Marcus Webb sat in a corner booth, his silver hair catching the afternoon light, a laptop open before him displaying spreadsheets and financial records. He looked up as Margot approached, his expression grave but not without compassion. He said, "Thank you for coming. I know this has been a difficult time." Margot slid into the booth across from him. "I did not come here for sympathy. I came here for ammunition." Marcus nodded, respecting her directness. "Then let me show you what I have found." He turned the laptop to face her and began walking through the evidence. Preston's hedge fund, Caldwell Capital, had been systematically defrauding investors for at least 3 years. The promised returns were impossible. Manufactured through creative accounting and paid out with fresh capital from new victims. Marcus explained, "Your husband's firm has taken in over $80 million from investors who believed they were getting 12 to 15% annual returns. In reality, the actual investments have been losing money consistently. He has been using new investor capital to pay the promised returns to existing clients." Margot stared at the numbers, her legal training allowing her to follow the complex web of transactions. "This is a Ponzi scheme, a textbook Ponzi scheme," Marcus said. "Exactly. And it gets worse. Vivian Cross is not just his mistress. She is his primary recruiter. She targets wealthy women at charity events, builds relationships with them, and eventually brings them into the fund." He pulled up a series of photographs showing Vivian at various galas and fundraisers, always positioned next to well-dressed older women who smiled at her with trusting warmth. Marcus continued, "I have identified at least 12 women who invested substantial sums based on Vivian's recommendations. Several of them are friends with your mother-in-law." Margot's mind raced through the implications. Eleanor must know. There is no way Preston could run something this size without his mother being aware. Marcus hesitated. "I cannot prove her direct involvement yet. But the Caldwell Family Trust has provided significant capital to the fund during liquidity crunches. Whether Eleanor knew the true nature of what she was funding is unclear." Margot leaned back in her seat, processing everything. The affair had been devastating enough, but this transformed Preston from a cheating husband into a criminal who had stolen millions from people who trusted him. She asked, "If we take this to the SEC, what happens?" Marcus replied, Federal investigation, asset freezes, likely criminal charges. Your husband would be facing decades in prison. Margot thought of Oliver, trapped in Eleanor's mansion, being told lies about his mother every day. She said, "Then we take it to the SEC." Marcus held up a cautionary hand. "It is not that simple, you. Right now, you are in a custody battle. If you are the one who triggers the investigation, Preston's lawyers will claim you did it for personal revenge. They will paint you as unstable, vindictive. It could hurt your custody case rather than help it." Margot's jaw tightened. "So what do you suggest?" Marcus closed the laptop. "We need to expose him publicly first. Create a situation where the fraud is revealed in a way that cannot be traced back to you. Once the investigation begins on its own momentum, you become a witness rather than an accuser." Caroline, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward. "Eleanor's 70th birthday party is in 3 weeks. Every major investor in Caldwell Capital will be there. The entire Greenwich social elite." Marcus and Margot both turned to look at her. Caroline continued, "What if the evidence was presented at that party in front of everyone in a way that no one could dismiss or cover up?" Margot's heart began to pound. "You want to crash Eleanor's birthday party?" Caroline smiled coldly. "I want to destroy it. My firm handles media for major events. I can get us access. The question is whether you have the courage to go through with it." For a long moment, Margot sat in silence. She thought of Oliver's face pressed against the car window as they drove him away. She thought of Eleanor's cruel words in the courthouse hallway. She thought of every lie Preston had ever told, every promise he had broken, every time he had made her feel small and worthless. Then she thought of the list Oliver had written, the things he would never forgive his father for. Margot said, "When do we start?" "Over the next 3 weeks." Margot transformed. Caroline arranged for her to work from the brownstone, coordinating with Marcus and Diana, who had finally cleared the bar complaint and returned to the case. Every day, Margot felt her strength returning, fueled by purpose rather than despair. She updated her appearance, not to impress Preston or anyone else, but to feel like herself again. She replaced the hollow-eyed woman in the mirror with someone who stood straight, who met her own gaze without flinching, who remembered what it felt like to be a force rather than a victim. Diana prepared the legal groundwork. Whatever happened at that party, they needed to be ready for the aftermath. Marcus refined the evidence package, organizing it into a presentation that even the most financially illiterate viewer could understand. And Caroline secured the access they needed. Her firm had been hired to document Eleanor's birthday celebration for a society magazine. Caroline would be there with a full production crew, including one very special guest. 3 days before the party, Margot visited Oliver during her supervised session. He looked thinner than before, dark circles under his young eyes, but he brightened immediately when he saw her. He whispered, "Grandmother says you are never coming back from me." Margot held him close. "I am coming back, Oliver, I promise. In just a few more days, everything is going to change." Oliver looked up at her with desperate hope. "Really?" Margot smiled for the first time in weeks. "Really, Supernoan, and then we are going home." Eleanor Caldwell's 70th birthday celebration was exactly the kind of event that made wealthy people feel important and everyone else feel small. The Caldwell estate had been transformed into a wonderland of white roses and crystal chandeliers. A string quartet played softly on the terrace, while uniformed servers circulated with champagne and artisanal hors d'oeuvres. Over 200 guests filled the grand ballroom, representing the cream of Greenwich society, hedge fund managers, corporate executives, old money families whose fortunes predated the Civil War. They mingled and laughed and complimented one another on their tasteful choices of evening wear. While outside the gates, the real world continued its mundane existence. Margot entered through a service door, wearing a simple black dress that Caroline had selected specifically for its understated elegance. She was supposed to be invisible, a member of the media crew documenting the evening, but invisibility had never been her intention. Caroline spoke into her earpiece. "The presentation equipment is set up. Video feeds are running to the main screen. We are ready whenever you are," Margot replied quietly. "I need to find Oliver first." She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting a champagne glass she had no intention of drinking, smiling at strangers who did not recognize her outside her context as Preston's quiet wife. She scanned the room for any sign of her son. She found Preston first. He stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by investors and admirers, laughing at something one of them had said. Vivian Cross clung to his arm in an emerald dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Margot felt her stomach clench with familiar anger, but she forced herself to keep moving. She found Oliver in the library, sitting alone on a leather couch, dressed in a little suit that made him look like a miniature businessman. His face was blank with the particular emptiness of a child who had learned to make himself invisible. Margot knelt in front of him. Oliver. His eyes widened with shock, then flooded with tears. Mom, what are you doing here? She pulled him into a fierce embrace. I told you I was coming for you. I need you to stay here. Okay, stay in this room no matter what you hear. Can you do that for me? Oliver nodded frantically. What is going to happen? Margot kissed his forehead. The truth is going to happen, and then we are going home. She left him in the library and made her way back to the ballroom, her heart pounding against her ribs. The moment was approaching. Everything she had suffered, everything she had lost, had led to this single point in time. Eleanor took the stage to thunderous applause, her silver gown catching the light like armor. A massive screen behind her displayed a slideshow of family photographs, all carefully curated to present a lifetime of elegance and success. Eleanor said into the microphone, "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this milestone with me. Family is everything, and I am so blessed to be surrounded by the people I love most." Margot caught Caroline's eye across the room. Caroline gave a small nod. The slideshow continued for another minute, showing images of Eleanor with dignitaries, celebrities, philanthropic achievements. And then the screen flickered. The string quartet stopped playing. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The screen flickered again, and then filled with text, bank statements, transaction records, a clear, damning timeline of fraud. A recorded voice began to play, one Margot recognized as belonging to a financial expert Diana had hired. The following evidence demonstrates a systematic pattern of investment fraud perpetrated by Caldwell Capital, resulting in losses to investors exceeding $40 million. The murmur became a roar. Preston's face drained of color. He lunged toward the AV equipment, but Caroline's crew blocked his path, cameras rolling to capture every moment. The presentation continued relentlessly. Photographs of Preston with Vivian, evidence of the corporate funds used to finance their affair, names and amounts of the investors who had been defrauded, some of them people standing in this very room. Eleanor screamed at the technicians to stop the presentation, but Caroline's team had locked the controls. Preston turned and scanned the crowd frantically, searching for the source of his destruction. His eyes found Margot standing near the back of the room. For one frozen moment, their gazes locked. Margot did not smile, did not gloat. She simply stood there, letting him see the woman he had underestimated, the woman he had tried to break, the woman who had just ended him. Then she turned and walked out of the ballroom, ignoring the chaos erupting behind her. She found Oliver in the library, exactly where she had left him. His eyes were huge with fear at the distant sounds of shouting. Margot held out her hand. "Come on, sweetheart. We are leaving." They walked out the front door of the Caldwell estate together, past the security guards who were too confused to stop them, past the arriving police cars with their flashing lights. Margot had never felt more free. But freedom, she would soon learn, came with a devastating price. The aftermath of Eleanor's birthday party dominated the news cycle for a week. Headlines screamed about the fall of Caldwell Capital, the arrest of Preston Caldwell on fraud charges, the humiliation of one of Greenwich's most prominent families. Margot watched the coverage from Caroline's apartment with Oliver pressed against her side, feeling something she had not experienced in months. Hope. The SEC launched a formal investigation. Federal prosecutors began interviewing investors. Vivian Cross was arrested attempting to board a flight to the Cayman Islands. Eleanor Caldwell retreated to her estate and stopped answering calls. Diana Hartwell filed an emergency motion to restore Margot's custody, citing the dramatic change in circumstances. The judge who had given Oliver to Eleanor now faced uncomfortable questions about her decision. For one beautiful week, Margot believed she had won. Then Preston's lawyer called. Randall Whitmore's voice was ice cold over the speakerphone. "Mrs. Sinclair, my client is prepared to make a deal." Diana responded before Margot could speak. "Your client is facing federal fraud charges. He is in no position to make deals. Whitmore continued as if Diana had not spoken. The evidence presented at the party came from documents that were illegally obtained. My client is prepared to file charges against Mrs. Sinclair for theft of corporate materials, computer fraud, and conspiracy. Margot's blood went cold. Whitmore said, "Furthermore, we have a forensic accountants reviewing every financial transaction Mrs. Sinclair was involved with during her marriage. Several documents bear her signature. We believe we can make a compelling case that she was a co-conspirator in any alleged agate fraud." Diana slammed her hand on the table. "That is absurd. Margot had no involvement in Caldwell Capital's operations." Whitmore's voice dripped with false sympathy. "Signatures do not lie, counselor, and juries tend to believe forensic evidence over protestations of innocence. Unless, of course, Ms. Sinclair would like to reconsider her position." Margot finally found her voice. "What exactly does Preston want?" Whitmore replied. "Full custody of Oliver. Mrs. Sinclair agrees not to testify against my client. She walks away quietly and avoids the complications of a federal prosecution." The call ended. Margot sat in stunned silence, her hard-won hope crumbling like sand. Diana spoke carefully. "This is a bluff. Those documents you signed were standard marital paperwork. They cannot possibly link you to the fraud itself." Margot shook her head slowly. "He made me sign things. Tax returns, investment documents. I never read them carefully. I trusted him." Caroline gripped her shoulder. "Even if some documents have your signature, that does not prove you knew what you were signing." Margot looked up with hollow eyes. "Try explaining that to a jury. Try making them believe the wife of a wealthy hedge fund manager did not know where the money was coming from. They will see the house, the clothes, the lifestyle. They will assume I was complicit." Diana said firmly. "We will fight this. I will bring in handwriting experts, forensic accountants of our own, character witnesses." Margot whispered. "And what happens to Oliver while we fight months of courtroom battles, years of appeals? He is 8 years old. He needs stability, not a mother facing federal prosecution." The room fell silent. Margot stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Brooklyn skyline. Her reflection stared back at her, ghostly and uncertain. She said, "Preston is not going to stop. Even from prison, he will keep coming after me. His mother has unlimited resources and unlimited hatred. As long as I am a threat to them, they will never leave us alone." Caroline asked gently, "What are you thinking?" Margot turned around. "I am thinking that I did not come this far to lose. But I also did not come this far to sacrifice my son's childhood to endless legal warfare." Diana said, "Whatever you decide, we will support you. But you need to understand something. If you take Preston's deal, if you agree not to testify, he might get a lighter sentence. He might be out in 5 years instead of 15. Is that something you can live with?" Margot closed her eyes, thinking of Oliver, his small hand in hers, his voice asking if she was brave. She opened her eyes with new determination. She said, "I am not taking his deal, and I am not running. There has to be another way." Diana leaned forward. "Then help me find it. Tell me everything about those documents, every signature, every meeting, every conversation. We will build a defense so solid even Preston's lawyers cannot crack it." Margot nodded slowly. "Where do we start?" Diana replied. "From the beginning. And this time, we do not leave anything out." The next week was brutal. Margot spent 12 hours a day with Diana's team, reconstructing years of financial decisions, identifying every document that bore her name, establishing her complete lack of involvement in Caldwell Capital's operations. Marcus Webb dug deeper into Preston's records, finding evidence that signatures had been forged, that Margot's name had been added to documents after the fact. And Oliver, staying with Caroline while the legal battle raged, wrote his mother a letter that she carried in her pocket every day. "Mom, you taught me that brave people tell the truth even when it is scary. You are the bravest person I know. Do not give up." Margot would not give up, no matter what it cost. The federal courthouse in Hartford rose like a monument to institutional power, its marble columns and brass doors designed to remind everyone who entered that justice here was serious business. Margot climbed the steps on a cold November morning, Diana Hartwell at her side, cameramen jostling for position on the sidewalk below. The trial of Preston Caldwell had become a media sensation. Prosecutors called it one of the most significant fraud cases in Connecticut history. Defense attorneys called it a witch hunt orchestrated by a vindictive ex-wife. And the public, hungry for stories of fallen titans, devoured every detail. Margot was called as a witness on the fourth day of testimony. She had prepared for this moment obsessively, rehearsing her answers with Diana until they felt natural rather than scripted. But nothing could fully prepare her for walking into that courtroom and seeing Preston sitting at the defense table, watching her with those cold eyes that had once promised her forever. She took the witness stand and placed her hand on the Bible. The clerk asked, "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Margot replied, "I do." The federal prosecutor, a woman named Catherine Pierce with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone who had sent dozens of criminals to prison, approached the witness stand with measured calm. She said, "Mrs. Sinclair, please describe your understanding of your husband's business during your marriage." Margot answered, "I knew Preston ran a hedge fund. He would discuss his work in general terms, but I was never involved in the operations. He told me his job was to make money for wealthy clients, and I had no reason to question that." Pierce asked, "Did you ever have access to Caldwell Capital's financial records?" Margot replied, "No. Preston kept his work completely separate from our home life. I did not have passwords to his accounts. I did not attend meetings. I was not consulted on investment decisions." Pierce continued, "The defense claims your signature appears on several documents related to the fund's operations. Can you explain that?" Margot took a breath. "Throughout our marriage, Preston would occasionally ask me to sign documents, tax returns, property paperwork, things he said were routine. I trusted him. I signed what he put in front of me without reading every page carefully. It is the biggest regret of my life." Pierce nodded. "And were you aware that some of those signatures may have been forged entirely?" Margot said. "I was not aware until my legal team conducted their own forensic analysis. Several documents bearing what appears to be my signature were dated from periods when I was verifiably elsewhere. I could not have signed them." Preston's defense attorney, Randall Whitmore, rose for cross-examination with the predatory energy of someone who smelled blood. He said, "Mrs. Sinclair, you lived a very comfortable life during your marriage. Did you not? The Greenwich estate, the designer clothes, the luxury vacations." Margot replied evenly, "I lived the life Preston provided," Whitmore pressed, "and you never questioned where the money came from, never wondered how your husband generated such impressive returns." Margot met his gaze without flinching. "I trusted my husband. That trust was misplaced, but it was genuine. I did not question him because I did not believe the man I married was capable of stealing from his own clients." Whitmore leaned forward. "But you do believe that now," Margot said quietly. "I believe the evidence." Whitmore shifted tactics. "You orchestrated the humiliation of my client at his mother's birthday party. You hired private investigators to follow him. You deliberately exposed private financial information in a public setting designed to cause maximum damage to his reputation. Is this the behavior of an innocent woman, or is it revenge?" Diana rose immediately. "Objection. Counsel is testifying," Judge Richard Blackwell said. "Sustained. Ask a question." "Counselor," Whitmore rephrased. "Mrs. Sinclair, what was your motivation in exposing your husband's alleged crimes in such a dramatic fashion?" Margot considered the question carefully before responding. "My motivation was to tell the truth. For years, I was afraid of my husband. I was afraid of his power, his money, his family. When I discovered what he had done, but I realized I was not the only person he had hurt. There were dozens of investors who trusted him with their savings, their retirements, their futures. They deserved to know the truth, and so did my son." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Whitmore pressed on, but Margot had found her footing. She answered each question with calm precision, refusing to be rattled, refusing to let him paint her as a scorned woman seeking vengeance. When the cross-examination finally ended, Margot stepped down from the witness stand with her head held high. Preston watched her walk past, and for the first time, she saw something other than anger in his eyes. She saw fear. The prosecution called its final witness 3 days later. Marcus Webb presented the forensic evidence tracing the forged signatures, the falsified returns, the systematic deception that had characterized Caldwell Capital from its inception. Expert witnesses confirmed that Margot had no meaningful access to the operations that constituted the fraud. The defense called character witnesses for Preston, colleagues who spoke of his business acumen and charitable contributions. Eleanor Caldwell testified that her son was a devoted family man who had been led astray by personal troubles. None of it was enough. On the ninth day of trial, Judge Blackwell asked if there were any final witnesses. Diana stood herping. "Your Honor, we have one more witness." Oliver Caldwell requests to address the court. The courtroom fell completely silent when Oliver walked down the center aisle. He looked impossibly small in his best church clothes, a navy blazer and khaki pants that Margot had purchased specifically for this moment. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he clutched a folded piece of paper in his hands with the desperate grip of someone holding on to courage. Judge Blackwell peered down from the bench with an expression that softened notably at the sight of the child. The federal court had strict rules about minor witnesses, but Diana had argued persuasively that Oliver possessed unique testimony the jury needed to hear. Oliver climbed into the witness chair, his feet dangling above the floor. A court officer adjusted the microphone to reach his level. The judge spoke gently. "Young man, do you understand why you are here today?" Oliver nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir, so I am here to tell the truth about my dad." On and the judge continued. "And do you understand that telling the truth is very important? That you must only say things that really happened," Oliver said. "Yes, sir. My mom taught me that brave people tell the truth even when it is scary." The judge glanced at Margot, then nodded. "Very well. You may proceed, counselor." Diana approached the witness stand with a careful kindness she reserved for the most fragile moments. "Oliver, I am going to ask you some questions. You just need to answer honestly. If you do not understand something, it is perfectly okay to say so. Are you ready?" Oliver took a deep breath. "I am ready," Diana asked. "Oliver, did you ever hear your father discuss his work at home?" Oliver said. "Sometimes he talked on the phone a lot. He did not think I could hear him, but sound carries in our house." Diana nodded. "And what kinds of things did you hear?" Oliver looked down at his hands. "One time, I heard him tell someone that the investors would never know the difference. He laughed about it. He said people would believe anything if you told them they were making money." A ripple of reaction passed through the jury box. Diana asked, "Did you ever hear your father talk about your mother in these conversations?" Oliver's voice trembled slightly. "Yes. He told Miss Vivian that Mom would take the blame if anything went wrong. He said she was too stupid to know what she signed." Oliver paused, fighting back tears. "My mom is not stupid. She is the smartest person I know." Margot pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Diana continued gently. "Oliver, you mentioned Miss Vivian. Can you tell the court who she is?" Oliver said. "She is the lady Dad was with when he was not with us. I saw them together at a restaurant once when Dad said he was working. They were holding hands." The jury members exchanged glances. Diana asked, "How did that make you feel?" Oliver's chin quivered. "It made me feel like our family did not matter. Like I did not matter. I wrote a list of all the things I would never forgive Dad for. I gave it to Mom because I wanted her to know I understood what was happening." Diana said, "We have that list in evidence. Can you tell the court what you wrote?" Oliver unfolded the paper in his hands with trembling fingers. He began to read aloud, his small voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "Things I will never forgive Dad for. Number 1, you missed my championship game to work, but I saw you at a restaurant with her. Number 2, you made Mom cry on her birthday. Number 3, you told me I was a mistake that trapped you. Number 4, you promised Disney World, but you took her to Paris instead. Number 5, you told Mom she was lucky you did not leave. Number 6, you forgot I exist." The words hung in the air like an accusation that no legal argument could refute. Randall Whitmore rose for cross-examination, but something in his demeanor had changed. The predatory confidence was gone, replaced by the awkward calculation of a man who knew that attacking a child on the stand would destroy whatever remained of his client's case. He asked only one question. "Oliver, do you love your father?" Oliver looked directly at Preston for the first time since entering the courtroom. His father sat frozen at the defense table, face ashen, eyes glistening with what might have been tears. Oliver said, "I used to love who I thought he was, but that person was not real. He was just pretending." He paused, then added quietly, "I hope prison helps him become a better person, because the dad I have now is not someone I want to know." Whitmore had no further questions. Oliver stepped down from the witness stand and walked directly to Margot. She wrapped her arms around him and held him close, not caring that the entire courtroom was watching, not caring about decorum or appearances. Her son had just done the bravest thing she had ever witnessed. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning their verdict: guilty on 47 counts of wire fraud, investment fraud, and conspiracy. Preston Caldwell would spend the next 25 years in federal prison. As the bailiffs led Preston away in handcuffs, he passed within feet of Margot and Oliver. He stopped, despite the officers urging him forward, and looked at his son one final time. Preston said, his voice broken, "Oliver, I am so sorry." Oliver did not respond. He simply turned and pressed his face against his mother's shoulder. Preston was led away into the corridor, and the door closed behind him with a sound of permanent finality. Margot held Oliver close and whispered, "It is over, sweetheart. It is finally over." 1 year and 3 months after Preston Caldwell began serving his sentence at a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania, Margot Sinclair stood in the kitchen of her new apartment in Brooklyn and watched the morning light spill across the hardwood floors. The space was smaller than anything she had lived in since college, a two-bedroom unit on the third floor of a converted brownstone. The furniture was secondhand, chosen for comfort rather than impression. The walls displayed Oliver's artwork alongside photographs from their new life together. It was, without question, the happiest home Margot had ever known. The settlement from her civil case against the Caldwell estate had provided enough for a modest fresh start. She received no portion of the marital assets, which had been seized by federal authorities to compensate defrauded investors. But Diana had successfully argued for the release of Margot's personal accounts and the return of property she had brought into the marriage, combined with her grandmother's jewelry, which she sold to fund Oliver's therapy and her own career restart. It was enough. Margot had returned to practicing law, but not in the corporate world that had consumed her 20s. She now worked at a nonprofit legal clinic specializing in family law, helping women escape situations like the one she had survived. The pay was modest, the hours were long, and every single day, she felt more alive than she had in the entire decade of her marriage. Oliver appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, his hair still damp from the shower. He had grown nearly 2 inches in the past year, his features sharpening from the soft roundness of early childhood into something that hinted at the young man he would become. He asked, "Is there time for pancakes?" Margot smiled. "There is always time for pancakes." She mixed the batter while Oliver set the table, their movements coordinated by the easy rhythm of 1,000 shared mornings. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer weighted with the tension of secrets and fear. Oliver said, "Mom, there is something I want to show you." He pulled a folded paper from his backpack and handed it to her. Margot wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened it carefully. It was a letter, written in Oliver's increasingly confident handwriting, addressed to his father. "Dear Dad," it began, "I have been thinking about whether to write to you for a long time. My therapist says it might help me to say what I feel, even if I never send this letter. So here is what I want you to know." Margot looked up at Oliver, asking silent permission to continue. He nodded. "I used to hate you. After everything that happened, after the trial and the things I heard, I thought I would hate you forever. But hate is really heavy. It made me tired and angry and sad all the time. So I have been working on letting it go. I do not forgive you for what you did to Mom. I do not forgive you for lying to all those people or for making me feel like I did not matter. Some things are too big to forgive, and that is okay. You have to live with what you did, not me. But I am trying to understand that you are a person who made terrible choices. Maybe you were sick. Maybe you were scared. Maybe you just got lost somewhere along the way. I do not know, and I guess I never will. What I do know is that I am not going to let what happened define who I become. Mom says that the best revenge is becoming someone you are proud of. So that is what I am going to do. I am going to be kind and honest and brave. I am going to take care of the people I love, and I am never, ever going to forget that my choices matter. I hope you find peace in there. I hope you become the person you should have been. But whether you do or not, I am going to be okay. Your son, Oliver. Margot set down the letter with tears streaming down her cheeks. She crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around her son, holding him with all the love and gratitude that words could never fully express. She whispered, "I am so proud of you." Oliver hugged her back. "I learned from watching you, Mom." They stood there for a long moment, mother and son, survivors of a storm that had threatened to destroy them both. The morning light continued to pour through the windows, warm and golden and full of promise. Later that evening, after dinner and homework and the comfortable rituals of their shared life, Margot sat alone by the window of their apartment. Oliver had gone to bed, exhausted from a full day of school and soccer practice. The city stretched out below, millions of lights flickering like earthbound stars. She pulled out the original list, now protected in a simple frame. The paper had grown soft with handling. The childish handwriting faded but still legible. "Things I will never forgive Dad for." But at the bottom, in fresher ink, Oliver had added one final line, a line that had not been there when he first wrote the list, a line he had added sometime in the past year without telling her. "Number 7. You made me stronger, and I forgive myself for loving you anyway." Margot traced the words with her fingertip, feeling the weight of everything they had survived. The betrayals, the battles, the moments of absolute despair when she had wondered whether she possessed the strength to continue. She thought about the woman she had been when she first discovered Preston's affair. Broken, afraid, convinced that her worth was defined by her marriage. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Someone who had walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, but tempered. Someone who knew her own strength because she had been forced to find it in the darkest of circumstances. Caroline called it a phoenix story, rising from the ashes of destruction to become something new. But Margot thought of it differently. She had not risen from ashes. She had climbed out of a cage she had not even realized she was trapped in. And every day of freedom that followed was a gift she would never take for granted. She set down the framed list and looked out at the city one final time before turning off the light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new clients at the legal clinic who needed her help, new milestones to celebrate with Oliver, new opportunities to build the life she had once been too afraid to imagine. So much was one. But tonight, in this moment, Margot Sinclair was at peace because she had learned the most important truth of all. Some endings were not really endings. They were doors finally opening in the right direction. And the woman who walked through them, the woman who chose courage over comfort and truth over safety, was not the same woman who had once been too afraid to knock. She was better. She was braver. She was free. And she would never be anyone's victim again.